Welcome to Women in Healthcare Leadership podcast series brought to you by Medscape Education. Our goal is to provide a platform where we can educate, advocate, and inspire women leaders to lift as they rise. With every episode, you'll hear from her as we showcase the perspectives, insights, and experiences of women who are leading the way in advancing women's health and empowering the next generation of women in healthcare.
Welcome to today's episode in Season 2 of our Women in Healthcare Leadership series. My name's Victoria Harvey-Jones and I'm Associate Director of Clinical Strategy at Medscape Oncology Global. I'm also privileged to be leading the Patient Centricity and Integration Initiative here at Medscape, where we're championing the inclusion of the patient voice in our independent education for healthcare professionals. Starting at education planning through to execution, thereby giving expert patients and global patient advocacy groups an important seat at the table to ensure that our education is as impactful as possible for our learners and ultimately the patients and their families who we all serve. It is through this Patient Centricity initiative that I came to work alongside two incredible women, Lorna Warwick, CEO of the Lymphoma Coalition, and Anne-Marie Baird, a Senior Research Fellow at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, and President of Lung Cancer Europe. I had the pleasure of speaking with Lorna and Anne-Marie earlier on in this season in episode 4, where we explored how they got into patient advocacy, their rise to becoming female leaders, the challenges they faced along the way, and how they overcame them, as well as the keys behind their success. So I invite you to listen to that inspiring conversation if you haven't already. But today, let's rejoin my conversation with Lorna and Anne-Marie, where together we explored the power of insights from patient advocacy groups to inform better cancer care for women.
So now I really want to move the conversation, on now to exploring the power of the insights. We talked about the power of data that, you're getting from your respective organization, the insights that you're getting from the community to really how are we leveraging those to inform better cancer care for women, but also in the wider community as well. So look, we talked on the last episode, but I just want to remind our learners as well, let's delve deeper now into your organisations. I'd love to hear more about when they were set up and what's the mission, of the Lymphoma Coalition, Lorna and Anne-Marie for Lung Cancer Europe. So Anne-Marie, let's start with you with Luce.
So Luce was founded just over 10 years ago. So we had big celebrations last year marking the 10th anniversary. Like a lot of advocacy organisations, it started out with a few people who were interested in setting up something to represent the lung cancer patient voice in Europe. And then it has just grown from there and it continues to grow and evolve. So we're very lucky. The mission of our organisation is very simple, in that it's to be the voice of Europeans impacted by lung cancer. We do that by collaborating with our members and other stakeholders in the community to destigmatize the disease and ensure that all those impacted by lung cancer get the care that they need to achieve the best possible outcomes. And we also, part of our mission is to empower our members to ensure a strong and effective lung cancer patient advocacy voice across Europe. And when we talk about best possible outcomes, we know that's only really possible by having equity and access to optimal care. So our vision is that everyone has access to that optimal care. We know there's so many innovations within the lung cancer space, but not everyone who could benefit from them has access to them. So we know we've a lot to do in that space, because just because we talk about it doesn't mean to say it's the real world lived experience for everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne-Marie. And Lorna, same to you. More about the Lymphoma Coalition, please.
The Lymphoma Coalition was founded in 2002, so we've been around for over 20 years. The organization was founded very organically in that 4 patient advocates happened to run into each other at the American Society of Hematology meeting and realized they knew different things about the disease and also were offering different types of programs to their patients and caregivers to support them. And they realized there was a lot they could learn from each other. And so now here we are 22 years later. And really now the focus of the coalition, our vision is a better future for everyone that's impacted by lymphoma. And the role the coalition has is in generating and providing trusted information, knowledge, and best practices to influence and improve care for those affected by lymphoma. I think we, in part, we do this by creating some of our own data, which I know we're going to talk about in terms of learning really about that ongoing patient experience and how things may be changing or not. But I do think like one of the challenges we have in this matches what Anne-Marie was just talking about is even though there are many new therapies coming into lymphoma, we are privileged that there's been a lot of successful activity in research that has led to much better treatment options for many subtypes, not all of them, because lymphoma is a very broad space with over 80 different subtypes. Yet at the same time, not every patient is going to have access to these, and whether that may be due to lots of different reasons, right? Whether it is a cost issue, some drugs with pharmaceutical companies, they may just not apply for availability in certain countries. And it may come down to a lack of knowledge even amongst the doctor or the clinical team that's caring for a patient about these new advances, because there are so many coming down that sometimes it can be hard to stay on track and have the right knowledge and able to deliver them. So lots of different issues that we're dealing with to ensure that patients are getting that best care. Definitely.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lorna. And I think this might be the part of the conversation I'm really looking forward to now. I think all of us, we've alluded to it, is, how your organizations, you obtain those incredible insights from the patients, the caregivers, the people in your communities. And how do you importantly then leverage that data and those insights to inform change? Okay. So Anne-Marie, over to you.
So for us at Lucha, we're a members-based driven organization. So really any of the things that we would take part in, whether it's internally or externally, is really all driven by our members, because obviously across Europe, there are so many differences, depending on what country you're in, or even within countries, because there's regional health authorities and things can be different within that too. So for us, what we do is we bring our members together. We bring them together in what we call our members meetings, and we bring them together at our annual general meetings and provide spaces to network, share best practice, talk about priorities within the community. But really within our members meetings, a lot of the work is done where we've done things like World Cafe, where we've gone to talk about any sort of topic. So open space, safe space for people to say whatever it is that they want to say and talk about. And all of those ideas and things then are brought together to input into our action plan for the upcoming year, so that we know that anything we are going to work on and try to deliver is based on the priorities identified by our members. Obviously, sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming because you get a lot of feedback back. So, when you open those doors, things are going to flood in. So we can't do everything. So then we may have to go back and do a prioritization exercise. And that might be with the board itself, so the board of the organization, or we'll put a quick poll out to our members to try and prioritize to ensure then, even though we might have identified 20 different things, that, okay, here are the three or five or whatever it might be. And then with the action plan put together, we have an executive team then that help put kind of the flesh on that, kind of meat on the bones, I guess is the phrase, to how that project is going to look like and what we're going to deliver at the end. And that's also done through our working groups. So for instance, we do a report every year. And that is based on a topic that is identified by our members. We put a working group together, which it has a chairperson, and then maybe 5, a little bit more of our members, and they talk about all of the different things that we can do, say for the report or whatever the project might be. So then that there's that constant communication and the touch point with our members to ensure that we are still on point, we are still working to deliver what it is that they want us to do for them. So that's kind of how we obtain insights from our community. And it ensures then that there's always that interaction and that engagement. But of course, like everything, you can always improve your interaction engagement. It's not like a one and done. It evolves over time, and you need to make sure that your organization is dynamic enough. And to Lorna's point in the previous part is you can't take anything personally. Things sometimes have to move, change, and evolve. And in terms of how we leverage the data to inform change, one of the best examples would be the report that we do. That's launched at the EU Parliament in Brussels, where we bring people together. We talk about the data that we have taken from our community. We have a call to action, and we really try very hard to get the MEPs and other policymakers involved. We also work with other pan-European and global organizations to bring a stronger voice, to link in with what they're doing, because again, not everyone can do everything at the one time. And then we really try to develop tools to equip our own members to do things at a national level as well. So national advocacy. So you're trying to hit it both sides, building up it nationally and then also hitting it at a European level as well. So that's really what we try and do. And we do have external activities we're involved in as well, like councils or advisory groups and things like that. So we want to have a voice on that. We want people who we are able to help to build capacity, to educate, to help create awareness, so that when someone goes to sit at a table of a clinical trial protocol development, whatever it might be, that they're comfortable knowing the terminology and comfortable with the conversations that's going on, so they can bring their real world lived experience into that. So that's a couple of the ways in which we gather the insights, and then how we try and leverage that data as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne-Marie. I'm just sat here in awe of all of that. So powerful. And I know, Lorna, you're going to share some equally powerful insights from what you're doing at the Lymphoma Coalition. So please.
Thank you. So we do some similar things to what Anne-Marie described, just to make sure we gain insights from our members, because it is a very broad community in terms of prioritization and key issues that they're facing in country. But because she described all of those so well, I'm really going to focus on how we are able to pull that patient voice directly in. In lymphomas, we're privileged because a lot of our patients actually survive. And I say that not lightly, because in a lot of cancers, what we do, they can't do because their patients don't live very long. But lymphomas patients, with the more aggressive subtypes of lymphoma, there's often good options, and so patients are surviving. And then there's also groups of lymphomas that are indolent or slow growing. So even though they're not curable, patients live for a very long time. And that allows them to do something very basic, but extremely helpful. And that's fill out our global patient survey on lymphomas and chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL, which we do every 2 years. And it's interesting when we look at the world of patient advocacy, because evidence has become a bigger and bigger word in our industry over the last few years. And more organizations are trying to do surveys and pull data. But Lymphoma Coalition has actually been doing these since 2008. So we've been evidence-based way before it was cool to be evidence-based. But the survey has become this massive and such an important tool for us to really look at what that patient experience is like. The survey we did in 2022 had 8,700 responses globally. And so that allows us to really break up that data and look at it regionally, Europe versus Asia Pacific, to look at it by subtype. So what's the difference between somebody who has diffuse large B-cell lymphoma compared to somebody that has follicular or chronic lymphocytic leukemia, for instance? We can look at that data by gender to see the difference between a male or a female experience. So we can look look at that data all kinds of different ways. And that has become a really powerful tool for us. When I joined the coalition, it was in 2017. So I was with the group for a year before I became CEO. And when I was brought in, it was really about, we have all of this data we're collecting, but we don't really know how to get people to pay attention to it. So our member organizations use it for planning. We use it internally for planning. But how do we get researchers, whether they're pharmaceutical or academic, how do we get them to pay attention to this? And so we can start making changes to care. And so that was my job when I joined, because I think I mentioned I love data. And so, data tells some amazing stories. But one thing you have to do with data is you have to communicate it in the language that the listener is used to using. And so for many patient organizations, taking that data and presenting it, whether it be at a scientific congress in an abstract or a paper, is a really big initiative and something outside of what they may have the skill set to do. And trust me, like, we've been doing surveys for so long, even running a survey is a big deal, because it's like, what questions do I ask so that they're valid and they're not leading, and making sure we're getting the information we need in a way that will be acceptable to these other communities. And then how do we get them to listen? And really, we found that by starting to publish the data, it made a big difference in how well it was included in other types of conversations. But some of the key steps along the way, I remember back in 2018 where we had our first abstract at the American Society of Hematology Congress, which is like the biggest conference really in our area. And we were so excited that, yay, we got accepted. And now we do, I don't know, like 10 of them a year. At all these different congresses, and we don't celebrate them. We're just like, yay, great. But it's all really good because it adds to that body of evidence. But now our focus is really on how is the data used and what are we making happen because we have that data out there. And I remember now, sitting at a Congress and being invited to bring the patient perspective using the data, and having this really intense discussion, disagreeing with a leading clinical expert in the area on discussion, and feeling confident because I had the data to counter him and say, no, that's not actually what the patients are telling us. There's a gap here that needs to be addressed. And having other doctors coming up to me later and wanting to change clinical practice because of what I was saying, that makes a massive difference, right? That's now how we measure the success of, has this pathway worked? Are we actually getting to the point that people are paying more attention? And just to, on top of the Global Patient Survey, which of course is a massive tool, we then go in, and because surveys, there's limits you can do with an online survey. And so then, we do focus groups, and we do something called community advisory boards that delve into some of those topics more in depth to get some of the other aspects that are leading into what patients are telling us via the survey. And then also have done some qualitative interviewing on certain topics. Like, for instance, we did one with patients that had gone through CAR T therapy, which is one of the newer therapies in the lymphoma space, and where there is really a lack of data on patient experience, to fill in some of those gaps of what their challenges were when they were actually going through the process of having, being chosen when to have that therapy, and then having it administered, and what their follow-up and long-term survival has been like. So there's been lots of different ways we are now collecting insights to supplement what we learn from the Global Patient Survey. And I will say, because we know it's really difficult, one of the commitments we have with our member organizations, if they have at least 100 responses in country, or if they focus on a specific subtype and are pan different countries, we give them their own data report so that they have stuff that they can work with locally, and it gives them a step up in kind of capturing this information and having it available. I have people on my team that are researchers and spend all their time analyzing this data for the most part. And so they'll do extra data analysis for our members as well, to help them in whatever situation that they're currently addressing locally. including, health technology assessments or drug access, where we'll create packages to make sure that they have the information they need to have to participate in those processes locally, whether it's a formal process like HTA, or if it's an informal process where they just want to influence decision makers. We'll make sure that they have some of the data that they need to do that. So love data. And I like how we've been able to actually see over the last few years some shifts in how people are responding to our data. And even where we have maybe other groups of academia researchers who have collected data, and there's some discrepancies with what our data is showing, being able to have open and honest discussions with them around why we see those differences and talking them through, because it's not always an assumption anymore that academia is right. They know there's validity in the data sets that are coming from the Lymphoma Coalition, which is great.
Wow. I mean, I've said wow so much in this conversation, haven't I? But just listening to you both there, honestly, it's incredible. And so, yes, data is power. Data is insights, and I've sat, I've said both of you, Anne-Marie and Lorna, have been on the panel of our educational activities that we're doing for healthcare professionals, and I've seen you bring in those insights. I've seen you bring in that data and the power that brings. It elevates the education and really does bring that global patient voice. And as you said, both of you, there has been this movement to really, collect this data, collect these insights, and then how we can leverage those, and those wonderful examples that you've just shared there about how you're leveraging them. And I'm scribbling ideas down, about how we can then, continue to work together, because we all have that collected mission to very much bring those insights from patients, from people living with these diseases and their family members as well. We know, they are a very important part of this, and how we can, bring these to the forefront. And, we talked about also this movement about patient advocacy groups, expert patients, having a seat at the table with pharma now as well, not just at the end to develop patient advocacy leaflets. Anne-Marie and Lorna are nodding away, which is wonderful as I'm saying this. And I find that so exciting that, you're being involved more now in terms of research as well, right at the start there to inform clinical trial design. And, that's, why I have been inspired to do that through our education, the team here at Medscape, to really, work with you. And that's, using these insights to sort of help shape all of these initiatives. As mentioned, pharma working with regulatory bodies. Anne-Marie, you mentioned being in Parliament as well, and government. And I love what you were saying there, Lorna, about giving local, patient advocates the power then to go and implement that in their own regions. So, and yes, we're all nodding away and how powerful this data is. So look, let's, move now. The data that you've got, what are the gaps in healthcare for women in your respective areas? Anne-Marie, if you could kick us off there from the insights that you've gathered.
Well, I don't know about Lorna, but for us, because one of our big ways to gather information is also with the surveys. And I'm sitting here feeling quite relieved that I was nodding away going, we do that? Oh, we do that? Oh, brilliant. We do that too. So I'm like, what else could we be doing and we might be missing? So it's great that there's such overlap in the different things that we do when we're generating our data and what we're trying to do with it. But I guess for us, from in terms of the gaps in healthcare for women, we are finding from our surveys that females are greatly overrepresented in our surveys that we do. We would find about 70-ish% of the respondents to the surveys that we put out are from females. We also have an overrepresentation of females in terms of the advocates within our member organizations. And up until last year, we were an all-female board. But I think that's sort of reflective away, in a sense, on our population, because lung cancer is increasing in younger females. And it does tend to be what's called oncogene-driven disease, where there tends to be better therapies available if people can get access to them. And again, I'm speaking in general terms, but then this tends to mean that you're getting more females sort of into the space and finding out more about what issues are for them in terms of gaps in healthcare. But I guess for us, what we're seeing, it's really to do with the general public awareness around lung cancer signs, symptoms, and risk factors is where we're seeing the gap, because a lot of the kind of public awareness and education tends to be around other cancers, and that is done very well. But there doesn't tend to be as much of a push around lung cancer awareness. And there's many surveys out there that people have done where they've collected data where females only tend to be worried about breast or cervical cancer, and lung cancer does not get onto the radar at all. And then even on to that is when you ask about sort of signs and symptoms or even risk factors, there doesn't tend to be a lot of awareness or in that area either. So I think that's kind of for us one of those gaps. So I mean, that's not just females, but it's also males. But I think particularly in our community, given that increased rate of lung cancer in younger females, it's something that we have to do better at in making sure the information is getting through to that cohort to say, look, irrespective of your smoking history, you may be at risk of this disease. And we've had many stories come to us where people have gone to primary healthcare and, you know, if they ticked the I am a current or former smoking box, they would have been sent for further investigation. But because that box wasn't ticked, they were then investigated for so many other things outside of lung cancer. So that really is the gap. And I think to your point, Lorna, about the data, we now have data showing that. So it's not all of these anecdotal stories anymore. We have data, we've numbers, we've figures, because obviously when you go to anyone who's policymaker or, you know, within the healthcare system, the first thing they're going to ask for is, well, where's your numbers? And we're now in a position to be giving those numbers and being able to back up those numbers. So really, I think for us, that's one of the areas where there's a gap for women specifically within the lung cancer space.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne-Marie. And if you could now just comment, how are you moving forward with addressing those gaps?
So in terms of addressing them, we did launch a large campaign called Get Checked. So it was all around symptom awareness, symptom identification. And then we had a big focus on risk factors as well. So the risk factors, we didn't just concentrate on tobacco use, we concentrated on all of the other factors that can increase your risk of lung cancer, because not a lot of people are aware of things like radon or, radon exposure, or they might not understand that, if someone else in your family has lung cancer, there is data to show that you could be at increased risk. So that's kind of how we really trying to delve deeper into that. And then we have member organizations that are then having very specific campaigns targeted towards primary healthcare in terms of symptom identification, in terms of ensuring they understand that it is younger females that are getting impacted, that you don't need to have a smoking history to be at risk. And the tagline used in our community is anyone with lungs can get lung cancer. So it's about using those kind of, I guess, simple taglines to really get the message across. So that's how we're really trying to tackle it, because it's there that we see the key unmet area for females within our community.
Oh, wonderful, Anne-Marie. And again, just thank you for all of the wonderful work that you're doing in the lung cancer community. I follow, Luce and all of the social media campaigns that you're driving as well. I think it's wonderful. So again, just thank you for everything that you're doing. Lorna, over to you now. Let's, with all of the incredible insights and the data that you've gathered through the, the surveys, the interviews, what, from your perspective then in lymphoma, what are the gaps for women?
So unlike Anne-Marie's survey, our survey is actually about half and half male-female respondents. So it's really interesting to me that we get that kind of response, because you're right. Usually it's females that are more likely to fill out surveys. Except for when we look at the caregiver subset, then we definitely see mainly females responding to that, which is a separate little topic that I will address. When we're just looking at the patients themselves, one thing we definitely notice with the females is they're more likely to report some psychosocial impacts from the disease than we see in the males. And, I've had some discussions, we've had some discussions in focus groups and other things about if males are underreporting or if it really is something that is more female predominant. But, in reality, we're still dealing with the fact that this is what the survey shows right at this minute. With that, we have put a big effort into really getting more information out there on the key issues that patients are facing. So we're looking at fear of relapse, fear of cancer progression, anxiety, and depression for the most part, though it does come down with females. We do see some body image issues as well rising to the surface. One thing, though, that really, heightened this is when we did the survey in 2022 and we looked at that anxiety and depression and other aspects and compared it to 2020, the difference with the pandemic was dramatic. In that, 70% of those who had anxiety said it was much worse than it was pre-pandemic, and 60% of those with depression said it was much worse. And people think because, we're no longer officially in a pandemic, I am not saying COVID went away. COVID did not go away. But people think because the pandemic went away and those restrictions went away, that then people's mental health will automatically revert to what it was before that. And that is not how mental health works. You need some extra supports to get you through and into a place where you're functioning perhaps in a better way. And so really, we've done a lot of work on that, highlighting these issues, both in reports that we've done, in conferences, and then also in providing more tools to our member organizations so that they can properly convey things that will help with anxiety, depression, and fear to their patients. And one thing we do know, because there is research, not ours, but we have confirmed some of this with our own data, is that patients that are well informed about their disease actually have less fear, less anxiety, and less depression. So, partially as well, we're trying to address some of that information level or health literacy issues that come with having to learn about a new disease that you've never heard of before and don't understand. Your natural experience of cancer is that it's going to probably you're going to have chemotherapy and then you're going to die, right? That's just how people think of cancer. So how do we change that message into something that's more realistic for what we see in the lymphoma space now, and having people understand that they really need to know the specific details of their diagnosis. I mentioned there's over 80 subtypes of lymphoma, so you can't just Google lymphoma and whatever you see applies to you. It probably doesn't. So how do we get patients to the point that they're actually looking and gathering the right kind of information that applies to their case? So that has been a lot of work for us, is really looking in those two areas, focused on health literacy and then focused on the psychosocial support. With the caregivers, I do want to say, we see that big influx or a higher response rate from females on that caregiver aspect. And I do think that partially comes into that nurturing role and how they might see themselves as a partner in care compared to how a male might think about their relationship to the patient. That would inspire them perhaps to fill out this survey. But even with those small numbers where we do look at the male-female dynamics, even then we'll see more of an impact of from a female perspective on how to manage everything else that they have going on in their life, while at the same time helping care for the patient and the extra stress and anxiety that brings to them. So, really seeing how we can bring that caregiver situation more into the forefront. Especially you look at some of the newer therapies like CAR-T again in lymphomas, and there's actually a really big role for the care partner to provide in that therapy, right? they're relied on to identify any changes that might be happening from a patient neurologically, and also recognizing some symptoms perhaps after they've gone back home, or side effects of the disease that need to be treated in a very certain way, right? So, sorry, I should say side effects of the therapy that need to be treated in a very specific way. With CAR T, some of the side effects you experience may resemble other things, like you have a stroke, for instance, but they're treated very differently. So how do we get the patient to the right care if something like that happens? And that puts this added extra burden on the caregiver over and above what they might be used to caring for their patient with lymphoma. And so, we've highlighted an extra level of stress, like the stress is increased to this nth degree, like, oh my gosh, it's now on me whether my patient lives or dies kind of stress, and how we can help remedy that and provide better support to the caregivers in those specific kind of situations as well.
Victoria, is it okay if I ask Lorna a quick question, if that's okay?
Absolutely, Anne-Marie. You don't need to ask permission. Go for it.
Lorna, what you're saying there in terms of those in a caregiving capacity, it really, really, strikes to a core to a lot of the things that we're seeing in the lung cancer community as well, because even though we're having that overrepresentation of females within our surveys, obviously it's open to people in a caregiving capacity as well. And again, most of those respondents in that kind of category would be females. And what we're finding in the data is that they are becoming a lot more isolated. They're really not minding themselves or looking after themselves. And some of the really worrying data we found was that the majority were missing their own medical appointments because of, the things that they had to do around caregiving. So, even if they've identified an issue with their own health, not following it up or not going for, maybe their breast cancer screening or, their smear tests or whatever it might be. So I'm just wondering, in the data that you guys have been generating, do you see that too? You've talked about the extra stress and the experiences of caregivers in the lymphoma field, but are you finding that they're also reducing their own self-care, not just in terms of kind of mental health, but also medically as well?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's a very basic answer, but yes. And when you add in things, our patients are hugely immunocompromised. The lymphatic system is a big player in your natural immunity, right? How you respond to any illness that you face, whether it's a flu or the measles. I mean, it doesn't have to be cancer itself. And so because they're immunocompromised, any other disease that's brought into the house can be hugely problematic for the patient. And so partially that comes into play, where we have caregivers express the fact that they're so worried about their patient's ability to face infections or face other issues that they limit themselves. So they're not associating with their social circle. They're not, it impacts how they work. It also impacts, again, how they seek their own medical care, because of their extreme worry for this patient. And if I leave them for a while, what's going to happen? Who's going to take care of them? So yes, a lot of similar issues. In the survey we have live right now, there are some further questions, diving into that a little bit more, especially when it comes into things like self-care and then the economic impact of the disease on the family as a whole. We know that our patients are often not able to work, but the amount of time that caregivers as well are missing that employment to make sure that you don't have this added stresses, which we know that they face, on how are we going to pay our bills, just generally my mortgage, and get food on the table and do all of those things, not necessarily related like how am I paying for parking at the hospital and drugs if we have to pay for them. Yeah. But yeah, definitely big issues.
Yeah. In our report last year, it was all around financial toxicity, and you could see it very clearly with people in a caregiving capacity as well as those living with the disease. And it was really it was very difficult reading, very upsetting reading, to the point that people were forgoing heating and other things because of all the additional expenses. Like car parking was something that came up time and time again, because it's just so expensive, and you could be there in the hospital for hours on end depending on what the scans are, the treatments are, and just that added stress on top of absolutely everything else. I mean, I know some people don't like that word toxicity, but really it is financial toxicity, because that's the impact it's having on these families.
And even, to the point that we've had patients who have voiced that they have stopped treatment because
Yes.
they'll know that they're leaving a lot of debt to their family, and they just don't want to do it. And those are such unfortunate choices that people feel like they need to make.
Yeah, we've gotten that out of our data as well. Whether it might not be, taking all of the treatment or missing treatment because of the financial impact of the disease, dealing with the side effects, accessing the treatment, whatever it might be. And yeah, again, like very, very upsetting reading to know that this is what's going on in the world today.
Thank you so much both for, taking the conversation in that way and highlighting all of these incredible insights. And I'm just sort of sat here listening, and my role is to really make sure that all of these insights, the data that you're sharing, that we communicate this to healthcare professionals, and that the patients and the caregivers are able to communicate that to their healthcare team as well. So I'd love, in the last part of the conversation, just to explore that, a little bit. And I think, we've talked about this together before, but the power of the patient voice in healthcare, the power of and how we can empower that voice, of the patient, of the families, as part of those healthcare decisions. And, I guess, where I'm sitting, I want you to tell me, how can I help with that? How can medical education help, with that for healthcare professionals to make sure that we're reaching a point where the patient voice is heard, is listened to in healthcare. So ultimately, people get, the right treatment, and they're supported to live their lives in the way that they want to. So I'm going to open the floor. I'm not looking at either of you, but, who would like to, start? Lorna.
Yeah, sometimes it's really interesting to me, because when I look at our data, I think we see it all the time. We're always in the data, and something seems so basic to us that is being missed by the clinical community. And it surprises me when we'll talk about it and they're like, what? Like, it's just this magical thing they've never heard of before. And so I think sometimes, even from our perspective, it's bringing some things back to a basic level that we think is basic. How do we communicate that to the clinicians, and not just the really, pointed or interesting things that we saw different in the survey this year? I will say as well, some of those things, they're actually clinical practice guidelines coming from ASCO or ESMO and other groups addressing them, but they're not implemented in clinic. So it's going back to an education perspective, like, why aren't you following the clinical practice guidelines on cancer-related fatigue or on psychosocial distress? Because there are some very simple, basic tools available that don't require a lot of extra time in clinic that you could use to highlight where issues might be for a patient. And if you implement them, then you're acknowledging to a patient that those topics are also important. Because I think some of why a patient goes into a medical appointment and doesn't talk about their fatigue, for instance, is because it's been minimized earlier in a conversation. And so they think it's not important. Or they don't realize that their anxiety or their fear are good things for the doctor to hear about, so that they can have a discussion around why that is happening, because maybe it's just an information gap that needs to be filled. But sometimes there are other things that can be done, whether that's medication or different supports that are available to patients to help them cope. And instead, patients are kind of trying to handle those things on their own, or struggling to find ways outside of the clinic to manage them. And Dr. Google can give you all kind of information, good and bad. And so finding the right kind of resources can be really difficult. Whereas if you're actually directed to them, that's so much easier from a patient perspective. But a lot of it is like, helping patients understand that all of the things that are influencing how their care is progressing, including how they're feeling, is important to have those discussions and bring them up in a clinic. And really thinking about their, really focusing on what is most impacting them at this particular time, even if it's not something that's very medical, like whether you have nausea or not, that they may be used to answering when the physician drives the conversation. So it's really talking about even, my one thing to doctors I say all the time is like, if you just add one thing to your conversations with your patients, is just to ask them, what's the one thing that's really bothering you right now? Of all the things that are happening in your life, what's the one thing that's really bothering you? And I know it opens up a can of worms because they may bring up things that are totally outside of a doctor's comfort zone. But that doesn't mean that we still don't need to help them. And so, really thinking of that response from a community perspective, because patient organizations have great resources. It doesn't always have to be an answer that's only available in the clinic to give the patient the support that they need to have a better experience overall, despite the medical outcomes of their disease.
Oh, thank you so much, Lorna. And again, so much that we've talked about, I try and take on board, and thinking about how we're approaching it through our education, and that conversation is going to evolve throughout the treatment journey. We've talked a lot that that conversation at diagnosis, the conversation throughout and those, as you say, those things that are perhaps bothering the patient and the family, how can we support them as well, is going to evolve. So I think that, it's something I've sort of really learned through, speaking with you both and many other patient advocates, the importance of that, how it evolves, and the importance of communication as well. But Anne-Marie, please, from your perspective.
Well, Lorna has really covered so much of it, but in terms of the education side, I think communicating to healthcare professionals and others that patient advocacy organizations are trustworthy and are credible are huge things. Because then that's not only going to help the person who goes into the clinic to have those conversations, as you're talking about, Lorna, that they're empowered to talk about the fatigue or the nausea or whatever it might be that's going on within their life. But it's also important for the medical professionals to understand that their priorities may not be the same priorities that people living with the disease have. And I think one of the really important things that I've learned is, generating the patient-driven data, which, reflects the real world population, and translating that across to the healthcare community is never, ever make an assumption. Because I think what happens a lot is they're making an assumption, we can make an assumption, and sometimes you do have to call out the simplest things for people to go, okay, I never thought that would be an issue or a problem or whatever it might be. So really just not making those assumptions. And I think also, the education you give to HCPs and others, the data that we generate as patient organizations, we need to be better at measuring their impact, measuring the metrics that's around it. And that's really to your point, Lorna, there's all of these guidelines in place. There's all of this literature and information out there, but are they being used at the end of the day? And if they're being used, how are they being used? What difference are they making? Because nothing's static, everything's dynamic, everything's like a living document these days. So we need to be constantly evolving it to better fit the purpose, because there is so many things happening within the cancer space. So we shouldn't ever think that just because we create something that people are automatically going to be signposted to use it and are automatically going to use it. We need to ensure that we have that constant feedback and ensuring things are fit for purpose always.
I love that, Anne-Marie. And I think we're both, or all of us, around this virtual table here. It's all about impact, isn't it? Making sure that what we're doing is having a positive difference. And it's something I'm always reflecting here as well, of making sure that the education we're developing is having an impact, and how can we, I mean, we love data, how can we measure through our data that our education, is having an impact on clinical behaviour? Is it impacting the integration of shared decision making? Is it empowering, as you said, Lorna, for clinicians to be asking those questions about what's really important to them? And that's certainly something I'm taking very much on board here, to make sure that we're doing, so we can say yes, our education, and through the incredible insights that I'm able to glean from both of your organisations, that we can develop that impactful education that then's going to make a difference. But at the end of our last conversation in season 2, we closed, didn't we, with my final question to you, the call to action, advice for our listeners. So let's see if we can do that again to close this conversation out. So I'm choosing no one in particular, but Lorna, go for it.
From a patient organization perspective, I would just encourage you to really start gathering data. And I know it can sound like a really big undertaking, but at the same point in time, reach out and ask people that are already doing it and find out how they do it and if they can provide you some advice. Why it's important is that patient data gathered by patient organizations, I think, is usually more an honest reflection of what that experience is like than what is gathered through clinical trials or what may be gathered through other academic studies. Because the difference is we can ask all kinds of questions about that overall patient experience. And oftentimes patients are more honest with us. So they're not worried about whether they're going to, if they tell you that they're having these side effects, be removed from a clinical trial or have their drug altered or something like that. That's not going to happen. They're not going to worry about the fact that the doctor, when I talked about this before, didn't think it was important, so I don't talk about that anymore. But with you, I can talk about it because it's still important to me. So we see more honest reflections, I think, of that patient experience in our data. As well, a lot of times the validated tools that have to be used in clinical trials or other research is limited in that those tools may not have moved along to reflect modern day therapies and modern day patient experiences. So there's gaps, they're missing things. And so with our data, we're collecting stuff that supplements what might have been collected in a trial and actually can lead, and has in our case, led to the contribution to new tools being developed, but also to clinicians going back and looking at a therapy and looking at a different area of work because something was highlighted in our data that had not come up in their clinical trials. And so there's lots of different ways that data can be used on top of using it for health technology assessments or drug approvals and your own internal planning that make it super, super helpful. So start. I know, like I said, it can be challenging, but reach out and talk to people that have been there, done that, and find out how, we started on our path, and definitely take some good advice if it's not something that you feel like you're equipped to do right away.
Oh, I love that, Lorna. And it's what strikes me about the advocacy world is you all just want to help each other, and I've witnessed this on this conversation, Anne-Marie asking advice from Lorna and vice, you're validating each other, you're learning from each other. And that's what's really struck with me as I've had more conversations with, with you and others. And it's, as I said, I use the word inspiring probably too much, but it's so true. So same to you question, Anne-Marie. Please.
Well, again, you've pretty much covered everything that I would have said, Lorna. The thing that I would add is really, and you've alluded to it already, Victoria, as well, is, make that start and reach out to people, see what the best practices are, see what other people have done within the space. And I would say not just within your own community, any cancer community, because, there are an awful lot of commonalities irrespective of the type of cancer someone may have. So, don't give yourselves barriers and sort of territorial issues from the get-go. Always reach out. And what's the worst someone can say is no, but at least you've reached out and you've attempted to establish a relationship that can then help input into what you're doing. And I think Lorna's really important point of that honesty. I feel we are a safer space when it comes to sharing information. People feel less judged. People feel more open to really saying just how it is, and it's really a truer reflection of that real world lived experience. And, make a start. There's a phrase, and I'm not sure if I've got it correctly, but perfection shouldn't be the barrier to progress. And I can't remember now who said that, but that's something that we have to think about. If you need to make a start within your community, make a start. Not everything is going to be perfect, but you learn, you evolve, you find out what doesn't work, what does work. But by standing still and not trying that, we're never going to move the needle forward. So just give it a go, just try, because it really can make such an impact for your community.
Thank you both so much for joining me today. The conversation has just been incredible. I've learned so much. I'm coming away inspired and ready to continue in my own way to be making a difference. It's been a real privilege for me to be involved in this conversation today. So thank you both so very, very much.
So thank you, Victoria, for actually inviting me here. It was a great conversation. And I would just like to say, where you were talking about using your network and reaching out and asking for help if you need it, Anne-Marie and I actually did not know each other before you introduced us and brought us together for this conversation. And yet through our discussions, I know that I now have somebody else I can reach out to and call upon and say, can you help me with this? Because I've learned a lot from her during our conversation today. And new connections may come in unexpected ways, but always pay attention to those new people that are brought into your world, and think about how you could work together and really share with each other to move everybody forward. I think it's fabulous. Thank you.
And I echo that as well. It's been fantastic.
Oh, well, look, that has literally made my day, made my 2024 even, and this is what it's about. So thank you both for that. Fills my heart with joy, genuinely. And look, I hope everyone listening has enjoyed it as much as I have. We have this conversation, and please stay tuned for the next episode of our Women in Healthcare Leadership series. Thank you to all our listeners. We really do appreciate you tuning in, and wishing you all a fantastic day wherever you are.
Thanks for joining us. Tune in next week as we continue our journey to amplify the voices of women leaders in pharma and medicine. Hear From Her is brought to you by Medscape Education. Please subscribe to Hear From Her on your preferred podcast channel and follow us on LinkedIn. Until next week, remember to lift as you rise.